The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when I found him. The kind of relentless downpour that turns dirt roads into rivers and makes you question whether the sun will ever shine again. I was checking the fence line on the back 40 of my property, the part that borders the old logging road nobody uses anymore, when I saw the shape lying in the tall grass. At first, I thought it might be a deer. We get a lot of roadkill out here, and sometimes the animals wander onto private property to die. But as I got closer, pushing through the wet grass that soaked through my jeans, I realized it was a person. A man, maybe in his 30s, wearing a faded denim jacket and work boots that had seen better days. He was face down, arms spread wide, like he'd just collapsed where he stood. No obvious wounds, no blood that I could see through the rain. I knelt beside him and pressed my fingers to his neck, already knowing what I'd find. Nothing. His skin was cold, waxy, he'd been dead for a while. I sat back on my heels, rain streaming down my face, and looked around. The nearest house was my own, a quarter-mile through the woods. The logging road was maybe 50 yards away, but I hadn't heard any vehicles in days. How had he gotten here? And more importantly, who was he? I pulled out my phone, but the signal was weak. 1 bar, maybe 2 on a good day. I tried calling the sheriff's office, but the call wouldn't go through. The rain was getting harder, and I knew I needed to make a decision. Leave him here and try to get help, or move him somewhere dry while I figured out what to do. The decent thing would be to call the authorities, let them handle it properly. But I've been down that road before, and it never ended well for people like me. Small-town sheriffs ask too many questions, and I'd already answered enough questions to last a lifetime. Besides, the man was dead. Another hour or 2 wouldn't make a difference to him, but it might make all the difference to me. I made my choice. Getting him back to the house was harder than I expected. He was dead weight, literally, and the rain had made everything slippery. I ended up fashioning a makeshift stretcher from a tarp and some fence posts, dragging him through the woods like some kind of strange funeral procession. My house sits on 20 acres of mixed woodland and pasture, inherited from my grandfather, along with his tendency to mind his own business and expect others to do the same. It's not much to look at a 2-story farmhouse with a wrapped porch and a red metal roof that sounds like thunder when it rains. But it's private, and privacy is worth more than gold these days. I pulled him into the barn, out of the rain, and laid him out on an old horse blanket. In the better light, I could see he was younger than I'd first thought. Maybe late 20s, with dark hair that curled at the edges and a face that might have been handsome before whatever happened to him happened. His clothes were worn but clean, and his hands were soft, like he wasn't used to manual labor. That's when I noticed the tattoo. It was on his left wrist, partially hidden by his jacket sleeve. At first glance, it looked like a simple series of numbers, 247,691, but there was something else underneath, smaller, harder to read. I pushed the sleeve back and saw it clearly, a small symbol that made my blood run cold. I knew that symbol. I'd seen it before, carved into a tree deep in these woods when I was just a kid. My grandfather had found me there, studying it with the intense curiosity that only children possessed. He'd grabbed my arm, harder than he'd ever grabbed me before, and marched me back to the house without a word. Later that night, he'd sat me down and told me a story I'd never forgotten. Some things are better left buried, he'd said, his voice heavy with the weight of years. Some secrets are meant to stay in the ground. But here was that symbol again, tattooed on the wrist of a dead stranger in my barn. And suddenly, I understood that whatever secret my grandfather had been protecting all those years ago was about to become my problem. I spent the next hour searching the man's pockets, looking for identification, for some clue about who he was or what he was doing on my land. Nothing. No wallet, no keys, no phone. Just a small piece of paper, folded tight, and tucked into his back pocket. I unfolded it carefully, expecting to find a phone number or an address. Instead, I found a hand-drawn map. It was crude but detailed, showing the old logging road, the creek that runs along my property line, and what looked like a specific location marked with an X. The same symbol from his tattoo was drawn at the bottom of the map, along with a date from 25 years ago. My hands were shaking as I looked at that date. 25 years ago, I was 10 years old, living in this same house with my grandfather. 25 years ago, he'd found me at that tree with the symbol, and he'd been scared, really scared, in a way I'd never seen him before or since. I looked down at the dead man, and for the first time since I'd found him, I felt afraid. Not just concerned or worried, but genuinely afraid, because I was starting to understand that his death wasn't random, and his presence on my land wasn't a coincidence. Someone had sent him here, looking for something, and now that something was my responsibility. The rain finally stopped around midnight, but I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and staring at that map, trying to make sense of what I'd stumbled into. Every few minutes I'd look out the window toward the barn, half expecting to see lights or movement or some sign that I wasn't alone in this anymore. But the night stayed quiet, and eventually, I made another decision. I was going to bury him. I told myself it was the practical thing to do. No identification, no way to contact family, no clear cause of death. The authorities would ask questions, I couldn't answer, and they'd probably take my land apart looking for answers I didn't have. Better to lay him to rest quietly and let the dead stay dead. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared of that symbol, scared of what it might mean, and scared of what might happen if the wrong people found out he was here. My grandfather had spent his whole life keeping some secret buried, and maybe it was time for me to do the same. I waited until dawn, then loaded my truck with shovels and headed to the back of the property. There's a small hill overlooking the creek, shaded by old oak trees that have been standing since before my grandfather was born. It seemed like a peaceful place to rest, and far enough from the house that I wouldn't have to think about it every day. Digging a grave is harder than it looks in movies. The ground was soft from the rain, but it was still backbreaking work. By the time I dug down 4 feet, I was soaked with sweat and my hands were raw from the shovel handle. But I kept digging, driven by something I couldn't quite name. When I finally had a hole deep enough, I went back for the body. He seemed heavier in death than he had in life, and it took me 3 trips to get him positioned properly. I wrapped him in the horse blanket, said a few words that seemed appropriate, and started filling in the hole. As I worked, I found myself thinking about my grandfather. He'd been a good man, honest and hardworking, but he'd carried secrets that had weighed on him until the day he died. I'd always wondered what those secrets were, and now I was starting to understand that maybe I didn't want to know. The sun was setting by the time I finished. I packed the earth down tight, scattered some leaves over the fresh dirt, and said another prayer for a man whose name I'd never known. Then I walked back to the house, took a long shower, and tried to convince myself that it was over, but it wasn't over. It was just beginning. 3 days later, Sheriff Martinez showed up at my door. I'd known him for years. He'd been a deputy when my grandfather was alive, and he'd always been fair with me. He was in his 50s now, with gray hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. "Morning, Sam," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind if I come in? I need to ask you a few questions about something." My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "Of course. Coffee. That'd be nice." We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd studied that map 3 nights ago. Martinez took his time with the coffee, like he was in no hurry to get to the point, but I could see something in his eyes, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Sam, I'll cut to the chase," he finally said. "We've had some federal agents asking questions around town. They're looking for someone, and they seem to think he might have come through this area." "Federal agents?" I kept my voice neutral, but my stomach was churning. "FBI. They're being pretty tight-lipped about it, but from what I can gather, they're looking for a man who went missing about a week ago. Someone they describe as a person of interest in an ongoing investigation." Martinez pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. My blood turned to ice. It was him. The man I'd buried under the oak trees, looking very much alive, and wearing the same denim jacket I'd wrapped him in. "Have you seen this man, Sam? His name is David Chen. He was last seen heading north on Route 9, which would take him right past your property." I looked at the photograph for a long moment, my mind racing. David Chen. So he'd had a name after all. But that didn't make any of this easier. "No," I said finally. "I haven't seen him. But then again, I don't get much traffic out here." Martinez nodded, but he was studying my face carefully. "The thing is, Sam, these federal agents are pretty convinced he's in this area. They've got teams searching the woods, and they're asking permission to search private property." "What kind of investigation?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "They won't say, but between you and me, I get the feeling it's something big, something that goes back a long way." He finished his coffee and stood up. "I'll be honest with you, Sam. I've known you since you were a kid, and I've got no reason to think you'd lie to me. But if you do see this man, or if you find anything unusual on your property, you need to call me right away, for your own safety." After he left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at that photograph. David Chen. The name didn't tell me anything new, but it made him real in a way that changed everything. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was someone with a life, maybe a family, people who were looking for him, and I'd buried him in my backyard. The next few days were torture. I kept expecting to see federal agents at my door, or to wake up to the sound of search teams in my woods. Every car that passed on the road made me jump. Every phone call might be the one that ended everything, but nothing happened. The agents searched other properties in the area, but they never came to mine. Martinez stopped by once more, just to check in, but he didn't ask any more questions. And slowly, I started to convince myself that maybe I'd gotten away with it. Then I found the second body. It was a week after I'd buried David Chen, and I was checking the area around his grave to make sure the rain hadn't washed away any of the dirt. The grave looked undisturbed, but as I was walking back toward the house, I noticed something that made me stop cold. There was another mound of earth about 50 yards away, partially hidden by fallen leaves and overgrown with weeds. It was old, much older than the grave I dug, but it was definitely a grave. And it wasn't the only one. As I searched the area more carefully, I found 2 more mounds. 3 graves, all old, all carefully hidden. I was standing in the middle of a small cemetery that had been there for years, maybe decades, and I'd just added a 4th grave to the collection. My grandfather's cemetery. I spent the rest of the day exploring the area and what I found made my blood run cold. The graves were arranged in a rough circle around a large oak tree, and carved into the bark of that tree was the same symbol I'd seen on David Chen's wrist. But this carving was old, weathered by years of rain and snow, and there were more symbols, carved into stones, scratched into smaller trees, even burned into a wooden post that had been driven into the ground at the center of the circle, all the same symbol, repeated over and over like some kind of ritual marking. I thought about what my grandfather had told me all those years ago. Some things are better left buried. Some secrets are meant to stay in the ground. But the secrets weren't staying buried. They were crawling out of the ground, tattooed on the wrists of dead men who found their way to my property. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to dig up one of the old graves. I chose the one that looked newest, though it was still obviously years old. I told myself I needed to understand what I was dealing with, that I had a right to know what was buried on my own land. But the truth was, I was scared and desperate, and I needed answers. I started digging just after midnight, using a flashlight to see. The ground was harder than it had been when I'd buried David Chen, packed down by years of rain and settling. But I kept at it, driven by a growing sense that I was running out of time. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something solid. Not a coffin, but something wrapped in heavy canvas. I cleared away the dirt and pulled it up, my hands shaking as I untied the ropes that held it closed. Inside was a man's body, but he'd been dead for much longer than David Chen. Years, maybe decades. The body was mostly bones now, but I could still see the remnants of clothing, and there, on the skeletal wrist, was a faded tattoo. The same symbol, but with different numbers. I sat back on my heels, staring at the bones, and finally understood what my grandfather had been doing all those years. He hadn't just been keeping one secret buried, he'd been running a graveyard for people who couldn't be buried anywhere else. People with that symbol tattooed on their wrists. People who'd died carrying secrets that someone wanted to stay dead. But who were they? And why were they still coming? I was about to find out. As I was rewrapping the body, I heard footsteps in the woods behind me. I turned, my heart hammering, and saw a figure emerging from the trees. It was a woman, maybe 40 years old, with short dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You must be Sam," she said, her voice calm and professional. "I'm Agent Sarah Williams, FBI. I think we need to talk." I looked down at the open grave, the wrapped body, the shovel in my hands. There was no way to explain this. No story that would make any sense. I was caught, and we both knew it. "I can see you're confused," Agent Williams said, stepping closer, "but I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because I think you can help me understand something that's been bothering the Bureau for a very long time." She gestured toward the grave. "Your grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, was what we called a caretaker, someone who provided final resting places for people who couldn't be buried through normal channels. People who'd been involved in classified operations, or who'd seen things they weren't supposed to see." "You knew about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We suspected. Your grandfather was a good man, Sam, but he was also a man who understood that sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes people need to disappear completely, and that includes their bodies." Agent Williams pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of photographs. They were all men, all roughly the same age, and they all had the same symbol tattooed on their wrists. "This symbol," she said, "identifies members of a program called Project Blackbird. It was a classified operation that ran from the 1970s through the early 2000s. The people involved were trained in deep cover work, infiltration, intelligence gathering, very dangerous work." "What happened to them?" I asked. "They started dying. Not in the field, but years later, after they'd been deactivated and returned to civilian life. One by one, they were found dead under mysterious circumstances. No obvious cause of death, no signs of violence. Just dead." She showed me another photograph, and I recognized David Chen immediately. David was one of the last surviving members of Project Blackbird. We'd been keeping him under protective custody, but he escaped a week ago. "We think he was trying to reach your grandfather, but obviously, my grandfather died 2 years ago." I finished. "Yes. We think David was coming here to warn you about something that made him risk everything to get here." Agent Williams closed the tablet and looked at me seriously. "Sam, I need you to understand something. The people who killed David and all the others are still out there. And now that David's dead, they're going to come looking for answers. They're going to come here." "Who are they?" I asked. "We don't know for certain, but we think they're connected to the original Project Blackbird program. People who want to make sure the secrets stay buried, no matter what it takes." As if on cue, we heard the sound of vehicles approaching through the woods. Multiple engines, moving slowly but steadily toward us. Agent Williams drew her weapon and motioned for me to get down. "Looks like they found us," she said grimly. The vehicle stopped just out of sight, and we could hear doors slamming, voices calling out in the darkness. Agent Williams spoke quietly into a radio, calling for backup, but I could tell from her expression that help was too far away. "How many people are buried here?" she asked. "I don't know. At least 3, maybe more. We need to get to your house. Is there another way out of these woods?" I thought about the layout of my property. The old hunting trails my grandfather had shown me as a kid. There's a path that leads to the creek. We can follow it down to the road. Show me. We left the open grave and started moving through the trees, staying low and quiet. Behind us, I could hear the search teams spreading out, calling to each other as they moved through the woods. They were being methodical, covering every inch of ground. Why are they doing this? I whispered as we moved. Project Blackbird wasn't just about intelligence gathering, Agent Williams replied. The people involved saw things, learned things, that certain people want to keep secret. Things that could bring down governments, expose corruption, destroy lives. What kind of things? The kind that get people killed? We reached the creek and started following it downstream. The water was running high from the recent rains, and we had to be careful not to slip on the wet rocks. Behind us, the voices were getting closer. There's something else, Agent Williams said as we walked. Something David was trying to tell us before he died. He was already dead when I found him. No, Sam, he wasn't. I stopped walking and stared at her. What do you mean? The medical examiner's report showed that David died of poisoning, a very specific type of poison that takes several hours to work. He was alive when he reached your property, but he was already dying. But he was unconscious, barely breathing. He was trying to stay alive long enough to deliver a message. We think he managed to hide something on your property before he died. Something important enough to risk his life for. I thought about the map I'd found in David's pocket, the one with the X marked on it. I'd been so focused on burying him that I'd never bothered to check what the X actually marked. I think I know where it is, I said. We made it to the road, without being seen, but Agent Williams' backup still hadn't arrived. Her radio crackled with static, and I could hear the frustration in her voice as she tried to reach her team. We're on our own, she said finally. How far is it to the location on the map? About half a mile back toward the house, but we'll have to cross right through the search area. Then we better hurry. We doubled back through the woods, moving as quietly as possible. The search teams had spread out, but they were still concentrating on the cemetery area. If we were careful, we could circle around them and reach the location marked on David's map. It took us 20 minutes to work our way through the trees, stopping every few yards to listen for voices or movement. When we finally reached the spot marked on the map, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. It was just a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across, with a large boulder in the center. The boulder had been there as long as I could remember, and there was nothing obviously unusual about it. But as I looked closer, I could see that someone had been digging around its base. David was here, Agent Williams said, examining the disturbed earth. Recently, we searched the area carefully, looking for any sign of what David might have hidden. It was Agent Williams who found it, buried in a shallow hole behind the boulder. A small metal box, wrapped in plastic to keep it waterproof. Inside the box was a USB drive and a handwritten note. The note was brief. For Sam Mitchell, your grandfather saved my life once. I hope this saves yours. The truth is on the drive. Use it wisely. Agent Williams plugged the drive into her tablet, and what we saw made everything clear. Files, photographs, financial records, all documenting a massive conspiracy that went back decades. Project Blackbird hadn't been shut down in the early 2000s. It had been privatized, sold to the highest bidder, and used to eliminate anyone who threatened the wrong people. The people hunting us weren't just trying to cover up old government secrets. They were protecting a multi-billion-dollar assassination network that had been operating for 20 years. We need to get this to the authorities. Agent Williams, said the real authorities. But before we could move, we heard footsteps in the woods around us. We were surrounded. Agent Williams, a voice called out from the darkness. Step away from the civilian and surrender the device. FBI Agent Williams shouted back. I'm a federal agent. Not anymore, the voice replied. You were terminated an hour ago. Unauthorized investigation, exceeding authority, compromising national security. You're now a fugitive. I looked at Agent Williams, and I could see the understanding in her eyes. The conspiracy went deeper than either of us had imagined. There was no one left to trust, no authority that hadn't been compromised. What do? I whispered. We run, she said, and we make sure this information gets to the right people. We bolted from the clearing, crashing through the underbrush as gunshots echoed behind us. I led the way, using my knowledge of the property to find paths that would be hard to follow in the dark. But our pursuers were professionals, and they were gaining ground. We made it to the creek again, but this time we couldn't follow it downstream. The road was blocked, and we could see vehicles positioned at strategic points along the water. We were trapped. There's a cave, I said, remembering something my grandfather had shown me years ago. It's hidden behind a waterfall about a quarter-mile upstream. We can hide there until morning. Will they find us? Not if we're lucky. We started climbing upstream, using the rocks in the creek bed to avoid leaving tracks. The water was cold and fast, and more than once I slipped and nearly fell. But we kept going, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. The cave was exactly where I remembered it, a narrow opening behind a small waterfall that had been carved out by centuries of flowing water. We squeezed through the opening and found ourselves in a space just large enough for two people to sit comfortably. Now what? I asked. Agent Williams was already working on her tablet, trying to upload the files from David's USB drive. I'm sending this to every news outlet I can think of. If we don't make it out of here, at least the truth will survive. Will it be enough? It has to be. We sat in the cave for hours, listening to the sounds of the search teams moving through the woods. Sometimes they came close enough that we could hear individual voices, and once someone actually walked past the waterfall, but they never found us. As dawn approached, the sounds of the search began to fade. Agent Williams checked her tablet and confirmed that the files had been successfully uploaded to multiple news sites and government servers. It's done, she said. Whatever happens now, the truth is out there. We waited until full daylight before leaving the cave. The woods were quiet, and there was no sign of our pursuers, but we both knew they were still out there, waiting for us to make a mistake. I need to get back to the house, I said. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. Agent Williams looked at me questioningly. Do what? Finish what my grandfather started. Dig up the rest of the graves. Identify the bodies. Make sure their families know what happened to them. These people deserved better than unmarked graves in the woods. That's going to be dangerous. The people who killed them are still out there. Then we better make sure they don't get the chance to kill anyone else. We made our way back to the house, moving carefully and staying alert for any sign of trouble. The cemetery was empty, but I could see that someone had been there. The grave I'd opened had been filled in, and the disturbed earth had been covered with leaves and debris. They're trying to hide the evidence, Agent Williams said. Then we better work fast. We spent the next 2 days carefully excavating the remaining graves, documenting everything we found. Each body told a story of betrayal and murder, of people who'd served their country only to be killed by the very system they'd protected. But we also found something else. Hidden in one of the graves was another metal box, this one containing documents that my grandfather had apparently saved. Financial records, communications, photographs, evidence that Project Blackbird had been corrupt from the very beginning. Your grandfather was building a case, Agent Williams said, as we reviewed the documents. He was going to expose the whole thing. Why didn't he? Because he was murdered too. The medical records were there in black and white. My grandfather hadn't died of natural causes, as I'd always believed. He'd been poisoned, just like David Chen and all the others. But he'd had time to hide the evidence before he died. Time to make sure the truth would survive. He was protecting you, Agent Williams said. He knew that if you found out too soon, you'd be killed too. But I found out anyway, because David Chen made sure you would. He knew he was dying, and he knew you were the only one who could finish what your grandfather started. As we worked, I found myself thinking about all the years I'd lived on this property, all the times I'd walked past those graves without knowing they were there. My grandfather had carried this burden alone, protecting me from the truth while slowly building a case against the people who'd betrayed his country. On the third day, Sheriff Martinez showed up again, but this time, he wasn't alone. He had federal agents with him, but these were different agents, real FBI agents, with credentials that checked out and supervisors who could be reached. Sam Martinez said, his voice heavy with concern. I think you better tell me what's been going on out here. I looked at Agent Williams, who nodded. It was time to tell the truth. We spent the next 6 hours explaining everything. The bodies, the conspiracy, the cover-up that had been going on for decades. The real FBI agents documented everything, taking photographs and collecting evidence. This is going to be big, one of them said. Bigger than anything we've seen in years. What happens now? I asked. Now we do our jobs, Martinez replied. We find the people responsible, and we make sure they pay for what they've done. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. The conspiracy went deep, and some of the people involved were still in positions of power. It would take time to sort out who could be trusted and who couldn't. There's something else you need to know, Agent Williams said. The people who killed David and the others, they're not going to stop. They'll keep coming until everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then we better make sure the truth gets out first, I replied. Over the next few weeks, the story broke in newspapers and on television across the country. Project Blackbird, the assassination network, the cover-up that had lasted for decades, it all came pouring out. Some of the people involved were arrested, others fled the country. A few simply disappeared, probably killed by their own people to keep them quiet. But the truth was out, and that made all the difference. The bodies we'd found were identified and returned to their families. For proper burial, the families were told the truth about how their loved ones had died and why. It wasn't much comfort, but it was something. Agent Williams was reinstated and promoted, tasked with heading up a new task force dedicated to investigating government corruption. Sheriff Martinez was elected to the state legislature on a platform of transparency and accountability. And me, I stayed on the property, tending to the land and making sure the graves were properly maintained. My grandfather's secret was finally out, but his legacy lived on. He'd been a good man who'd done what he thought was right, even when it cost him everything. Sometimes, late at night, I'll walk out to the cemetery and stand among the graves. I think about the people buried there, and about the courage it took for them to do what they did. They'd been betrayed by their own government, but they'd never given up fighting for what was right. The symbol that had once marked them for death now marked them as heroes, and their sacrifice had finally brought down the system that had killed them. David Chen's grave sits a little apart from the others, under the oak tree where I first buried him. I visited often, to tell him that his mission was successful, that the truth he died to protect had finally set us all free. The old logging road is busier now, with investigators and journalists and families coming to pay their respects. But the land is still peaceful, still quiet. The kind of place where secrets can rest safely, and where the truth can finally be told. Some things are better left buried, my grandfather used to say, but he was wrong about that. Some things need to be dug up, brought into the light, and shared with the world. Because the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the truth can set you free.